German-Korean project that we try to present.
And he collaborated.
I don't know, but for me, the startup one,
I've got to admit that
artistic activity and to facilitate critical reflection, both bilaterally, that is Germany, Korea, or multilaterally with other European countries, or even between, finally, a project that we did with, so that's our contribution as cultural organization to Franco-German-Korean project, where we try to
Hello, good to see you all, or almost see you. Now I see you better. Welcome to the Anxious to Act Keynote Conversation. I'm Christopher Gansing, the Artistic Director of Transmediale, and this is the closing keynote conversation of this year's Transmediale Conversation piece. I think it's a fitting moment to again express a word of thanks to the institutions that also have made this year's Transmediale possible. They're visible there on the screen, actually. Kulturstiftung des Bundes, HKW. I would also especially like to mention the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung for the conference program. So thank you. I'd also thank our brave translators, actually, who have been doing a marathon job here during a few last days. Tonight, we will have Hito Steyerl and Nicholas Mirzoeff, each delivering a lecture here and then engaging a conversation moderated by the Anxious to Act stream chair, Oliver Lerone Schultz. We have structured the program of the conversation piece along these 4 streams that are also visible on the screen. And actually, in this moment, it would be interesting to do a little audience demographic test, because this is the Sunday, and many kind of festival pass holders, participants, they leave. So if you were already here during the previous days, could you raise your hand? Oh, great. So most of you have heard me say these words 1,000 times already. So I'm not going to repeat too much about the structure of the program. I'd just like to remind ourselves of that historical reference of the conversation piece, painting, a genre that kind of depicted different form of idealized settings for having a conversation, tea salons, gallery viewings. And these streams, they kind of take their starting point more in what we call like a disrupted ideal scene of digital culture, different anxious states where we're caught between action and inaction. And for each stream, we curated a keynote conversation that instead of a classical, one-person keynote lecture, always then featured 2 thinkers who each give a statement and engage with each other's thoughts. And we also took care to not take the kind of most obvious choices or combinations of people for each of these streams. But we try to broaden up the topics that are within them, that Oliver will talk more about, to larger cultural frameworks, and, hopefully come up with some kind of new position or a new vocabulary with which we can address the topic of, for example, media acts, as we had the previous panel here. Oliver Lerone Schultz, who will take the place here now, Oliver studied philosophy, history of science, and ethnography here in Berlin. Also, he studied in Berkeley, cognitive science, political economy, the political economy of industrial societies. After that, he started focus on post-media research. He was active at the Center for Digital Culture in Lüneburg at Leuphana University, where he also co-founded the Post Media Lab and was editor of the Post Media Lab book series. Currently, he's associated fellow in the research group Loose Couplings, Collectivity at the Intersection of Digital and Urban Space at the University of Hamburg. And Oliver, please join me here on stage or take my place. Please welcome Oliver Lerone Schultz and the speakers.
So I can also welcome everyone to a highly expected encounter. I'm always of the opinion that biographies are one of the most nagging things of conferences and panels and keynotes. But maybe that I'm in the luxury to say that because the two speakers that we will hear in the conversation tonight are so well known that they probably, for sure, don't need such a lengthy introduction. What we are very anxious to see now is an encounter that we were hoping for some time. It's a first-time encounter as far as I am aware of and know. And it is a keynote as well as a conversation. That's at least the spirit that our conception of this format should bring, but also the pre-conversations between the three of us. So we will see, as kind of closing the Anxious to Act stream that has been also opening the transmediale conversation with the global ports, we will now maybe close some ports, but hopefully open some eyes to some questions of visual politics in the current state of affairs. And we will hear two lighthouses, I would say, or if we don't want to overbear it, simply lights in the darker afterglows of a social landscape, and a visual landscape that, as we have discussed in some other events, has seemingly at least become darker in many respects. So Hito Steyerl and Nicholas Mirzoeff, for us, belong to those hybrid and enlightening wildfires that still manage to shed light in more muddy times of enclosure and subsumption, and that at the same time manage to shift roles very, how do you say, in agile ways, jumping the roles of different identities and roles between theory makers, critics, and activists and artists. So while vision, and vision with its link to the visual, surely seems in flux these days more than ever, and has become part of a whole global system of what Hito Steyerl calls post-production, the re-entering of image production and visual production into our daily lives and into the reproduction of a global reproduction machine, something that that also Tom Hullert calls imagineering. In these times, it remains, this is kind of the assumption of the Anxious to Act stream, it remains critical and vital to understand the re-articulations as much as the new recalibrations of the visual. So just yesterday, we've seen a 3D hologram from the future or the synthetic present. And for better or worse, it was kind of a laser pointer into a future that we are just about to enter. It shows us the social network production of the new imagescapes. And we have learned from the maker and some of the people around Miko Hatsune, the real people in Japan, that projection is as much about vision as it is about new questions to materiality and to new needs to reflect on the real nature of this networked state of production and reception that we all have become part of. From Jutta Weber, we have learned at the very same spot that we are entering into a conversation today, that projection is always the attempt to win the race for possible futures. So this conversation is also done not only to reflect in a critical way the analysis of the visions of the now, but also to try to reflect on what visions of the future can still pertain in these muddy circumstances and in the eye of the algorithm, as Matteo Pasquinelli would call it. So for me, this double keynote constitutes part, as you could already hear, of an ongoing critique and discussion about the multiple forms of subsumption and closure that we are witnessing today and that might accelerate, as well as an ongoing investigation of the parallelograms, that was one of the titles of one piece here at Transmediale, and complicities of the post-digital, which is always part of the reflection of the Transmediale, of its complicity with tendencies of the post-democratic. In another session, Nishan Shah was qualifying the post-digital as a state in which the past is predicted and the future is previsioned for us. From Eyal Weizmann, we've heard about image complexes and the slow violence that is building up around these image machines, as well as ways to counteract that with new methodologies. And I was very inspired to see forensics kind of being offered as a new tool for activism and engagement using these new visual machines to another and better purpose. Connecting to this panel and this discussion, and it originally was supposed to hold the title of Acting on Vision, this is relevant to us and to the ongoing conversation we are entering now in terms of the need to reflect on different scales of activity, of personal action, being mediated to activism and to collective action, but also to personal vision, what you just see with your eyes in opposition or in contrast or in being augmented by those visual machines that now surround us everywhere. Some people like Christoph Wächter and Matthias Judd were introducing, I think very helpfully in this discussion at Transmediale, a new term, as we are looking for new terms and new terminologies here, of infrastructural violence. And I think this will be very much also the topic of the coming conversation, as it will be about the question of slow violence that Eyal Weizmann also introduced. We were surely reminded, and will be reminded now again, that with Langdon Winner, as Jutta Weber put it, that we do not use technologies as much as we live them, and just yesterday we lived some of them. So all that is left for me is to pre-calibrate a little bit the attention and your vision on the now upcoming conversation, to just underline that, or kind of bringing back to this stage also Weber's term of techno-rationality, and her underlining that this points us to a new rendering of the world by machines that very much functions as she put it, a recombinatorial search space for reconfiguring and remodulating the present. This, as I said in the beginning, is also cast into the light of a huge backlash that is not only technological, but as we have discussed in other parts of the stream, as much social and political in terms of the new forces of governmentality that are posed upon us, as well as kind of new nationalisms we currently see. So Brian Holmes re-asked the old question in one of the panic room sessions of Frederick Jameson of how are we now today remapping or resensing and refeeling where I live, or to talk about the collective perspective, where we live today. While Burik Arikan offered some mapping technologies to find out where we live, this session will as much be about a critical investigation of what the modes and the conditions of appearing in the social space and recognizing each other or being recognized by others actually can mean, and what it means for a critical political stance. So this brings me to the short biographies. The shortest one I found on the webpage, I think from all participants here, is actually from Hito Steyerl, which reads very simply: Hito Steyerl is a Berlin-based filmmaker and writer. I would leave it with that because I'm sure most of you know Hito Steyerl from virtual conversations or engagements, and just want to underline that we are very grateful that Hito made this extra effort of just coming from the US and taking this jet lag situation and still addressing us in this huge auditorium. And I, as warmly want to welcome another personal reference point for my engagement with visual culture. Always, as much as Hito, I was following, as probably a lot here in the room, the work of Nicholas Mirzoeff, who is professor of media culture and communication at the New York University, and has just published a book, How to See the World, which is exactly the question we want to ask ourselves. Again, just to underline, while this is keynote material, as festival organizers would say, and something I learned putting up this program, it is not outside of a conversation, and it is meant to be a real conversation. In that respect, I'm very thankful personally that for me this is the continuation of discussions we had years ago around the Globale Film Festival, around critical ways to see the world and engage, and with Nicholas to continue our encounter around Occupy at that time, where we first entered a conversation about visual politics. I think it's not too much to say that we can now gladly and warmly welcome two thinkers that are thinking actively against oppression and enclosure, but also I want to underline two thinkers that always would argue against spectacle. So this will be, by intention at least, no theory spectacle, but an encounter and a conversation, and hopefully a political conversation. In the end, something I don't want to take away too much from the talks, I can't anyways, but I'm very happy to see George Michael talk to Malcolm X tonight.
Hello, good evening. Thanks a lot for this most generous introduction, Oliver. Thanks a lot for having me. And thanks to everyone for being here tonight. Let me start with, this is probably almost the only image I have. And it's very interesting, in my view. What is it? It's a picture from the Snowden files. Laura Poitras was kind enough to open up parts of the archive for other artists to have a look at, and I got completely hooked with this one, which is secret and classified, as you can see, yet you can't see anything. But I think, and I'm going to argue, that actually everything is in that picture. Why? I think one of the first reasons is that basically most images, but also words, sounds, all kinds of information are coded in a way that makes it impossible for human senses to access them without mediation. Of course, it has been like that for a while now. But I think that, the spectrum of human vision is now really a minority, or has become just a tiny part of the things that are accessible to the senses of machines. So actually, I think that most images and data, information, sounds, whatever, exist in a form that is not accessible to the human senses, that's invisible. You cannot feel it, you cannot smell it, you cannot hear it. And this, of course, creates the problem that is already hinted at in this picture. How do you kind of filter a signal or any sort of information from this kind of invisible surroundings? And of course, this is also a huge problem, as it seems, for the NSA. They complain about it a lot. They had their own column on their internal website, which was called Signal versus Noise, to constantly, rehash this question, have this discussion. And on this website, they're also constantly complaining about the task of doing so. This is one entry from 2012, where a person just, complains of the total overload of data. She speaks about a sea of data in which she's afraid she might drown. And of course, this is not restricted example. It's a much more general situation. Actually, this picture was decrypted, and the context in which it was taken was made public last week. This is a grab, essentially, from a manual for a program called Anarchist. And this program was a program by the British Secret Services whereby they tapped Israeli drones. So they were basically feeding on Israeli drones to get some kind of information. And the interesting thing is that they have been doing so basically since 2007, which means that they might have, seen, hacked, recorded all the IDF campaigns against Gaza as well. But the thing is, and that's something that is happening very often with archives, that this kind of imagery doesn't exist in the archive, right? There is no clear image of any sort of attack, of intervention. Instead, there is all sorts of abstractions which look somewhat like that. It's like graphs and lines and just something. And they are explaining, how to decode a signal from the noise. But what happens is that they manage to decode this signal actually by utilizing an open source software for descrambling satellite television, which they found online, and then they proudly managed to, decrypt an image of 2 clouds. That was it. Anyhow, so this is basically the thing that's maybe more or less hidden in this noise. But I will propose a different methodology, of decrypting this kind of noise, of trying to extract a signal from that kind of noise. And it took me a long time to do this, and I had to train really hard. And it's, of course, a proprietary secret algorithm, which I developed myself, and I will just share it with you and teach you how to do it too. Because if you just focus on that image, and you have to focus very, very strongly on the center of the image, you will see that these lines start moving just a little, and there is some slight reflections and glints, coming from the screen, which indicates that actually what you're looking at is a huge surface of water. It's, the sea in the sunset, and you have a reflection of the setting sun on it. And actually, my first decryption of this picture is what you're seeing is actually the sea of data, right? That the analyst was talking about. This is a documentary image. It doesn't show you just random noise. It is the sea of data itself. So you will... it's a very cheap methodology, and some people also consider this to be a mental condition. It's something which is called apophenia, right? Apophenia happens when people see faces in clouds, for example, or when you see, the man in the moon, or the rabbit in the moon, or, faces on people on Mars, or something like that. So it's basically the act of the brain projecting some sort of pattern onto random data. There is nothing encrypted, there is nothing encoded, yet you extract a pattern. Now, why do I think this is interesting? Because I think that actually this is a methodology used by many analysts as well. Because I think that someone must have seen at least one specific face in this noise, because otherwise there's absolutely no explanation why a certain person got hit and blinded by a drone strike in Gaza in 2012. Her name is Amani al-Nasasra. She was 43 years old. She was sitting in front of her TV, and then suddenly there was a drone strike. And there was, she was not a militant, she was not associated to militants, not even the address was associated to militants. There was just absolutely no reason why this location was targeted. And the only reason I can see is that some act of apophenia was performed on some, unknown kind of noise, sea of data. This is something which is a much more general operation, because obviously the act of filtering a signal from noise or trying to separate information from noise is a hugely political act. And I just want to say I'm very scared. I think there's a lot of tech people out here. Don't yell at me. I know that I'm going to talk about very, very different technologies of filtering and processing here, and they cannot be compared, yet I want to talk about the political act of filtering as expressed through completely different technologies. But, the let's say, oldest form in which I have seen this kind of algorithm of separation and filtering described was written down by Jacques Rancière, who tells a story about ancient Greece. And they had an algorithm, apparently, for separating signal from noise, and that was speech recognition. How did that work? It was very simple. Whoever was a male, affluent Greek citizen was supposed to be speaking. And everyone else, meaning the foreigners, the women, the slaves, the children, they were supposed to just produce noise, or, as a direct quote, groans, garbled speech, just sounds. And I think this is probably the oldest, an old, it doesn't even matter whether it's true or not. I consider this a political fairy tale, which just shows how these kind of algorithms manage to separate different groups of people from one another and arrange them in hierarchical categories. And of course, today a lot of similar operations are underway. I was very surprised to see how this works in some specific detail. So, for example, how do you separate signal from noise if you are faced with a vast amount of data, a sea of data? One big data expert suggests cleanse dirty data from your systems. So I asked myself, okay, what are dirty data? Dirty data are obviously misspelled data, outdated data, data which are not, which machines cannot access because something is illegible in them. But here, this one guy from Booth, Alan, actually, he had a really interesting example. He said that, I don't have that. He said that he had an example whereby his team were analyzing the demographics of people who stayed at a chain of luxury hotels. And then their data showed that there was a group of customers which were teenage from a wealthy Middle Eastern country. There were a whole group of 17 years old staying at the properties worldwide. This guy said, we thought that can't be true. So this was dismissed as dirty data because it seemed just so unlikely that brown teenagers could be rich, right? I mean, perhaps they could be dead. That's more probable, right? But rich, this was so improbable that this was dismissed as dirty data and cleansed from the system. On the other hand, of course, there are much more, how shall I say, low-tech mechanisms for producing dirty data, and the simplest of all is something we witness certainly every day in Berlin, is not even register people like the refugees, standing in line in front of Lager. So you do not even give them access to register their data. They cannot even become dirty data. They do not even show. They are not even, acknowledged within the systems. And of course, they cannot claim any sort of the benefits they are entitled to by international law. So this is a very, very simple version of these algorithms. And another one, actually, I was just made aware of it yesterday. It's hugely fascinating. This is a bit more complicated. Maybe someone has brought it up already during the conference. So this is a new suggestion by IBM, who are trying to train their, machine learning system called Watson, which is quite well known, to separate Syrian refugees, refugees from so-called terrorists. How do they do that? By using unstructured data and putting them through a lot of different operations. So they hope to show, I'm reading from this, that their system could separate the sheep from the wolves, the masses from harmless asylum seekers from the few that might be connected to jihadism and so on. So how do they do that? They scan the dark web, for example. They scan lists of people who unfortunately were killed in Syria. But also, this is from other sources of information, they scan social media activities of people applying for refugees and try to come up with some sort of probability map, right? There in the bottom, it says, they create a score. It's like a credit score, right? Like a social score. And this is not an absolute indicator of guilt or innocence. It's basically a credit score to try to filter assumed, terrorists or jihadists from refugees. And this reminds me of something else which is entirely fascinating. It's the Chinese social credit score or social sincerity score, whereby basically all available data, your financial transactions, your online activities, also the things you buy are being analyzed, to extract some very interesting measure of social responsibility. One of the developers described it. For example, if someone plays video games for 10 hours a day, we're going to assume he's not a responsible person. Your credit goes down. So it's an extremely expanded operation that includes basically all aspects of your personality to abstract and condense them in just one score. So there is lots of these operations of filtering. I think most interestingly the one by IBM that try to separate signal from noise, so to speak, and by doing so create political categories and groups of people. Now I have, there is a very funny, in my view, and also really well-known visual example, which in my view gives a sort of metaphor or metonymy for this process. It's not exactly this process, but it visualizes this process. And this is about image recognition or pattern recognition. And you remember this one image, right? Which shows just noise. So what happens if you run a Google inceptionist algorithm over the noise and just do it many, many times? Then this is what you will see, and you know how these filters work. They are called filters. They are neural networks that are trained to recognize certain patterns, shapes, edges, and mostly actually animals and faces, because they are supposed to operate mostly in commercial smartphones, and I think that the assumption is that people will mostly photograph babies and pets, so eyes are very, very prominent. I have seen a list of, 1,000 items that these networks were trained to recognize, and there is about 200 animals on top, and then in 201 there's a gun. So you see that these networks are trained to recognize certain shapes, and the thing is that they also will recognize these shapes even if they are not there, right? Even if there is sheer noise, no information encoded whatsoever, the thing that will emerge is this or similar images of, countless eyes staring at you. And I think, why did I say that this was a sort of the metonymy of the unconscious of a society characterized by consumer surveillance is, of course, because this is really a very literal representation of how images are surveilling their users, right? It's not that you are looking at images anymore. They are looking at you. They are scanning, your eyeball movements, the time you spend with them, click patterns, and so on and so on. In that sense, I think that this is a brilliant visualization of the process of filtering, and this is really my favorite inceptionist image. I have to say that this was not run on just noise, right? This was run on just pasta. But what you see, is all these pets emerging. They are supposed to look cute, but they look very, very, I mean, they look depressed, actually. They look terribly depressed and gloomy. They stare at you from this bowl of pasta, and they seem to see, you are maybe a subject and a human, and you may own us, and you may even eat me in a minute, but I'm going to inform on you, right? I'm going to tell everybody which amphibian beagle exactly you are looking at. And I think that this is also a documentary representation. It's a document. If you think back to how Georg Lukács defined realism, he called the characters, the protagonists of realism, he called them typical characters because they embodied the objective social forces of our times. And I think this really embodies the objective technological forces of our times. And in this sense, it is a deeply, deeply realist representation. Okay. I was going to launch into a section about the Neolithic. It's my pet theory. I have been trying to say for many months that we are living in a sort of data Neolithic, where all these technologies that were developed during the Neolithic, like farming, for example, agriculture, mining, and so on, all of them come back in a kind of new form. But then it occurred to me that actually my whole thinking about the Neolithic is deeply influenced by Abdullah Öcalan's writings, or maybe let's say rather his ghostwriter's writings, because I think there's a sort of communal activity going on there. And I thought I'm not going to talk about the Neolithic today. I mean, just you can take it or leave it, but what I want to say is that the isolation of Öcalan has to end, and the peace process in Turkey and Kurdistan should resume. The situation is really, really terrible now. There's a lot of new political prisoners of conscience, and of course, a lot of military operations into civilian city centers or against civilians happening at the moment. So this is all I have to say about the Neolithic at the moment. I will come back now to this initial image I showed in the beginning. Sorry, this is a longer version. I told you that basically everything is encoded in this image, even though it doesn't show anything. Why is this? I think it's a document of someone else, of something else additional. And I would like to come back to this woman that got targeted for no apparent reason in Gaza, because we know that these images, they do not show the drone strikes, right? They were not recorded, or if they were, they are not part of the archive. And so all we know is something she told an interviewer. She said, "I can't see. Ever since the bombing, I can only see shadows." So I think that this is really the documentary content of this image, and it's plain for everyone to see, secret or not. We see what she cannot see. We see what she can't see. Ever since the bombing, I can only see shadows. So this is a documentary image of the shadows. And as such, I think that this is also a document of the drone war's optical unconscious, right, which is characterized by this tsunami of data, onslaught, operations of filtering, decoding, trying to, separate people into different categories and classes. And the question I'm left with at the end is there any way to ever unscramble the shadows that Amani has been left with? Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for staying to the end of this long festival. Thank you for not leaving after Hito Steyerl, which I thought you would all do. Thank you for Hito for that remarkable presentation, and it's a very hard act to follow, as you'll do my best. And I want to thank also Transmediale for inviting me to be here today. I'm going to speak about something that seems perhaps at first sight very different to what Hito talked about, but I think actually in many ways it's very much the same subject, the question of the visual commons. And I'm going to be speaking about racialized violence, and some of you may be tempted to think of that as a particularly United States pathology, which indeed it is, but I think it's also a condition of our current global situation. And what I'm hoping to think about a little bit in this presentation is how we might consider the infrastructures of white supremacy and how we might combat them. So I want to begin in the manner of Detroit activist Grace Lee Boggs, who passed last year, by asking, what time is it on the clock of the world? Since 2008, half the world's population is under 30. Since 2011, the global majority lives in cities for the first time in history. At present, 45% of people worldwide have some form of access to the internet. So these changed conditions together form a rupture with the prevalent doctrine of neoliberalism: there is no alternative. But there is, as we have seen in the recent social movements, especially since 2011 and now with Black Lives Matter. And in this rupture, we are looking to see what's happening. In 2014, at least 1 trillion photographs were taken. 400 hours of YouTube are uploaded every single minute. 700 million snaps are posted to Snapchat every day. I do not see this as a global narcissism, but as a symptomatic response to the experience of rupture and the crisis of the representational principle, from politics to mental health and the possibilities of appearance. What people are trying to create are not just images, but a just image of their own situation. What Hannah Arendt once called the space of appearance in which politics takes place has become networked as a set of interactive and intersensory relays, creating co-presence between physical and digital spaces. And so it's not simply a space in what appears is, as Arendt once had it, where men are together in the manner of speech and action. Rather, we make a commons, where people and their visualized data interact, in which, as Judith Butler has it, the material environment is actively reconfigured and refunctioned. That is to say, whatever media and mediations we make are also part of whatever it is to be the people and make the commons. Arendt's space of appearance further presupposed that one is not enslaved, but in the era of mass incarceration in the United States, with 2.3 million in prison and over 7 million in the criminal justice system, disproportionately people of color, many cannot make that presupposition, to say nothing of the undocumented or the refugee. So since 2014, we have expanded the questions of space, time, and appearance into the question of abolition democracy. When do we get free? Which is to say, in the Americas, what does it mean to say Black Lives Matter? This movement began online. People located each other using the hashtag. And then it became interactive between online information sharing and physical actions in the streets. In hashtag Black Lives Matter, matter is a question of value that goes beyond price and commodity exchange to a declarative statement of common value. This value is then neither exchange or use value. Casarino calls it surplus common, but we can simply call it love because it is embodied. In this space, I am undone as a bounded being, just as we are in love. The commons then is unbounded before and after enclosure by oscillating between networked digital spaces and refunctioned urban space. The commons breaks the frame, exceeds and extends representation, even as it is the object of depiction. The visual commons transforms the relation of the visible and the invisible, the visible and the sayable. It comes into being when people claim the right to look, which is formed by one person and another seeing each other, looking into each other's eyes, inventing each other. It is not the simple space of identification. The space called into being between them belongs to them collectively and not individually. It forms a commons. In terms of political theory, it precedes law and the concepts of the public, even as in terms of action, it simply refuses the law in order to contest and negate the existing forms of political legitimacy. The commons imagines and begins to experience possible futures. It opens new pasts to explain and ground those futures. So the commons struggles to be grounded in and as common sensation. The grounded commons creates and is sustained by the grounded depiction. In the past, that was a direct claim to land, as in the claim for 40 acres and a mule. In today's urban commons, ground means support, that is, sustainability in all its senses. In visual media, the ground is that which makes the scene of depiction possible, whether the ground of the painted canvas or the ground that makes figuration possible in photography. It's formed from all the senses and all the modes of perception. It precedes hierarchical modes of judgment and Hegelian recognition. It's the very possibility of appearance that enables politics. Such common sensation has long been separated by those with title to power from the political as incoherent or unintelligible, as Hito pointed out in her presentation. It appears to be spontaneous to those residing in the seats of judgment. More precisely, after long restraint and rehearsal, it overflows the enormous material and physical constraints set against it at moments of intensity. It is love, surplus, beyond the frame, because it makes common a way to be in the future, outside the enclosure. It is always becoming, always in dialectical formation, while being site-specific and multifaceted. That the moments keep coming, in which the energy contained in social and visual frames breaks out of the restraints imposed by and as the society of control, which is itself now notably out of control, I take to be the condition of the present and the hope for future years ahead. The sensation of the common today is the embodied form of the political in a networked world of global cities with majority young populations then. It is a phenomenon of transition, the sensing of the possibility of change in and about our bodies, interactive and interfaced with that part of embodiment that we'll call the mind. It's experienced as movement and in movements, kinetic and potential, performed in common space, intensely experienced and remembered. It explores our embodied sense of the just and the unjust, which is not just about codes of law, but what we know to be right. Its form in Black Lives Matter, from South Africa, as here, to South Carolina, is a persistent look at what white supremacy keeps out of sight, off stage, and out of view. Persistent looking combines a refusal to look away with a deliberate engagement with the loss of so many through reenactment. And we saw a remarkable example of that in A.L. Weitzman's presentation earlier in this conference. It calls for us to see what there is to see, not to be traumatized. Persistent looking is, however, performed in a very crowded visual field, as we all know. It counters the dominant monitoring of the state and the military-industrial complex, for whom the drone now provides what is formally known as the persistent stare, that's their own term for it, at targets of interest. The US military envisages this stare being mounted permanently over cities, whether insurgent or domestic, to keep permanent surveillance ongoing. Next, persistent looking has had to deal with the prohibition against looking on the ground by those deemed black and those denoted white. Under slavery, this look was known as eye service and was immediately punishable. During the Jim Crow period, the charge was reckless eyeballing, with a connotation of forbidden desire across the color line that authorized fatal violence in response. Although it was never formally part of the legal code, Such looking was used to aggravate assault charges to rape as recently as 1952 in the case of Matt Ingram that I'm showing you here. Reckless eyeballing remains part of the informal codes of the prison industrial complex, both inside institutions, as part of law enforcement, and indeed legal judgment. Remember that Freddie Gray's offense in Baltimore, his only offense, was to meet the gaze of a police officer in the eye, for which he ended up dead. So what will it mean to call this commons black? As Alexander Wahalia defines it, quote, blackness designates a changing system of unequal power structures that apportion and delimit which humans can lay claim to full human status and which humans cannot. So those with full human status are designated white, which may or may not correlate with their actual skin pigmentation. This system recognizes that in the Americas there can be and has been no sustained commons since the division of the continent by the color line. So these unequal and changing relations produce a series of effects, including these 6. 1, black is a reassertion of pride and collective identification as black, uppercase B, meaning descended from or connected to the African diaspora. This claim has resonated across US culture, from Ta-Nehisi Coates, who won the National Book Award this year, to Serena Williams, showing you here who wins, well, everything. And it has also generated pushback in the form of the undermining, of people's claim to be black. Black is also a rallying call for those who see revolutionary transformation as a necessity in the Americas. In this instance, then, it's an Atlantic world theory of revolution, derived from the Haitian Constitution of 1804, in which, as you can see, to be black was simply to be in Haiti, to affiliate and stay with the revolution, regardless of your personal ancestry. It affiliates in this instance, then, with Alicia Garza's statement in relation to Black Lives Matter that, quote, when black people get free, everybody gets free. Which means that unless black people get free, nobody gets free. There is no commons until and unless this condition is met. So it's not part of my endeavor to speak for black people, or more than capable of doing that, but it is my goal to disavow, undermine, and challenge white supremacy. 4th, black is therefore an encoded appeal to non-black audiences in either sense to register the simplicity and the power of the statement Black Lives Matter as a theoretical principle, and to measure it the failure of the classic civil rights movement to move past equality to justice. 5th, Black Lives Matter has become decoded as the means to understand the increase in homicides and the alleged, but not in fact happening, increase in killings of police in the United States. Spokespeople for the police are now calling this the Ferguson effect, meaning that police claim not to be able to do their jobs if subject to being photographed or videoed. So we register here that when black lives do matter, the social space of appearance has changed, meaning that police no longer control how events are viewed. So this ressentiment against Black Lives Matter is part of what is sustaining what we can call Trumpism. Trump is an avowed white supremacist who now has 5.7 million followers on Twitter, and that's up from 3.2 million back in September. So if you measure Trump's influence at 2 degrees of separation, the followers of his followers and their followers, he reaches the entire internet. So if we put these factors together to get Trump off the screen, what it means is that to revolt is to affiliate with blackness in a system where white supremacy is the militarized maintenance of hierarchy. To revolt and be black is to be beyond all recognition in this system, all claim to personhood. The visual commons in the Americas is that place where the black person and those in revolutionary affiliation with blackness see each other, invent each other, exchange the right to look and the right to be seen in a dialogic imagination, finding ways to trust, befriend, and love each other. The construction of this common sensation is produced when bodies deemed black position themselves, as we're seeing here on the screen, in places deemed white. The freedom of abolition is thereby a practice whereby we make ourselves visible to each other. Common sensation is a mutual and open recognition of the presence of black people and revolutionary blackness, and the means by which each allows the other to invent it. So to pick up on the resonance in Hito's presentation, when the Ferguson uprising began, Palestinians sent messages of support, as here, and practical advice on how to deal with tear gas to people in Ferguson. The Black Lives Matter movement sent activists to Palestine later and have produced a video that you can find online called We See Us, which is to say a visual commons has been formed between Black Lives Matter and the Palestinians. For Arendt, power was the guarantee of the space of appearance. For the commons, love, in its forms of common sensation, makes the network go live and creates the possibility of freedom, but it is a first and not a last step. For on the scene that might become that commons is another figure, that of the police. This is a screen grab from the first night of uprisings in Ferguson in August 2014. This police does not hail the black person, as Althusser once had it, nor do they say in the manner Rancière's cops, move on, there's nothing to see here. To be addressed in either of these modalities is indeed the mark of white privilege, how whiteness is now to be defined. For the black person and those gathered in solidarity with them, the police say, you are nothing. And this is not a speech act, but the firing of a weapon, an indexical performance. The defiant performance of vulnerability in the face of this force has become an assertion of common strength, one directed not at physical bodies, but at the body politic. The body politic, as you all know, is a concept derived from absolutist theories of sovereignty that distinguish the living body of the king from the body politic majesty that never dies. Power descends from the body politic to specific bodies, those of monarchs, whose power was in turn surrogated to their instruments, such as the overseer of the slave labor camp, who here adopts the same pose as that of Charles I before him. Today, the carceral state, whose lineage descends via the penitentiary to slavery, is the present form of the body politic that never dies. This extension of the prison industrial complex is formed by courts and all those representative bodies associated with them. Black bodies in protest performance have commonly refused their commodification in this system, together with a refusal to accept being killed, a refusal to abide by the verdicts of the grand juries, and a refusal to go back to normal, which has collectively amounted to a refusal of white supremacy. It has required a disruption of circulation, whether of traffic or shopping, because those are the only options presented to us as proper for those not allowed to see. In the Millions March in New York City on December 13, 2014, the French activist J.R. created a set of signs from an enlarged photograph of Eric Garner's eyes that put the right to look directly into the streets. Hashtag Black Lives Matter formed a new relation between vulnerable bodies and a body politic that can be harmed and can die in order to sustain a movement between grief and grievance in the judicial sense. The performances reclaim resistance as the right to existence, as abolition democracy, meaning, in the words of Angela Davis, aspiring to create the institutions that will truly allow for a democratic society. This commons was created by placing bodies in relation to violence, making them vulnerable, keeping them in motion, and forming movement images. So I want here to consider the formation of the crucial action, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, as the product of performative protest at and around the scene of Michael Brown's death in Ferguson. The evidence comes from cell phone cameras, mediated via Twitter, Vines, and Storify, a new archive for the history of the present. Although Hands Up flowed from what was believed to have happened, it was not a simple recreation of the scene of the murder. Now, the gesture of raised hands did imitate those made at the scene, such as here, those of a white contractor caught on a cell phone video. He's standing with his hands raised in a gesture that clearly asks, why did you shoot him? His hands were up. It expresses puzzlement and confusion as much as rejection. On the first evening after the shooting, protesters at Canfield Green came together to hold a vigil at the house of Michael Brown's mother. Confronted by police with dogs as if it was suddenly Birmingham in 1963, they responded by raising their hands. It's a montage then of the isolated and vulnerable body of Michael Brown and their resistance into a common identification. The next day, the chant, "Don't shoot," was added to the gesture and performed by itself again at the Canfield Green housing complex. In the handwritten poster in the center of this image, "Hands Up" was added to create the full phrase here at a demonstration in the front of the Ferguson police station. And then on the third day after Mike Brown's death, activists were circulating printed flyers with the slogan, "Hands up, don't shoot." These words were then combined with the action of raising hands as a call and response marching action. Hands up, don't shoot. It's a command to the police that says, when people have their hands up, don't shoot. In and of itself, this is then, or should be, an unremarkable statement. But it follows, our hands are up, you don't dare to shoot. By not only displaying vulnerability, but admitting to it and doing so in numbers, the performance gains a paradoxical strength. Hands Up was not in this sense addressed to the police at all, but to the commons, a body politic that can be wounded but does not submit and is open to others. And the feminist implication of this vulnerability as strength became clear when women formed the #SayHerName project. Performing naked to the waist in affiliation with African traditions, women blocked traffic with their bodies to force the connection between their visibility and the forgotten names of women killed by police over many years. Rekia Boyd, Sandra Bland, Kayla Moore, Shelley Fry, many, many more. Hands Up, Don't Shoot pauses the action at the crucial moment when any reasonable person, to use the legal phrase, would have ceased firing at a wounded, surrendering child. It concentrates our attention on the vital moment in the sense of living, as well as essential, before the definitive violence. The performance of Black Lives Looking is about the recurring present that we choose not to escape, continue to record in digital media and to circulate. Persistently, we choose to keep looking in the wake of a police war against its people and to feel the presence of the absent bodies of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, 12 years old, Yvette Smith, Ayanna Stanley Jones, 7 years old, and so many more. We feel in that repeated present the formation of the commons, the presence of the future. It opposes its repetitions to the representation of the state by the police, as the police. It affects the experience of what students in North Carolina in their We Demand document describe as anti-blackness, meaning, quote, the displacement, exploitation, slow death, and genocide of black and brown people. For the body of the commons, when it performs the body politic, is not eternal, like the body of the king. It is dying, but not dead. More exactly, it suspends death in the die-in, because death is the sanction applied by the carceral state and white supremacy for non-compliance. The new civil rights movement, like many before it, from feminism to ACT UP, as I'm showing you here, has reclaimed it as a means to disrupt commercial space and divert it into becoming a temporary commons. Rather than restage one death at a time, there have been mass die-ins, making it clear that all who might fail to comply are potential targets. When black counterpublics die in, the non-places of shopping malls and transport hubs become visible as a spatial component of the policed society, the only public spaces we are supposed to inhabit. Performed death surrenders to visuality's dominant viewpoint from above, making each person vulnerable, but creates a paradoxical sense of freedom as you rest your body with others in spaces where you never normally would, an intersection elsewhere. You experience solidarity as a collective body dying in. You may close your eyes, listen to the silence, broken only by counting that does not enumerate value, but reperforms the 11 statements, "I can't breathe," the last words of Eric Garner, the body of the commons, dying and yet refusing to depart. So where are we now? In adopting Eric Garner's words, "This stops today," hashtag Black Lives Matter asks us to value democracy in the sense of rule by those always and already without title to power. Our title is our breathing. When we breathe together. And we do so persistently, both to remain alive and to sustain the commons, requiring the abolition of the prison industrial complex and the police. But we could not get out of 2015 without one further reminder from the police as to how they break down any such possibility. The clear visual evidence of the killing of 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland on a 2-second clip of CCTV footage was then turned into evidence for the non-indictment of the killer cop by so-called video experts. I'm showing you one frame here. The video was slowed into an extensive frame-by-frame analysis, rendering the few seconds into 326 multiple frames. Here, Rice's elbow appears fractionally bent by comparison with the previous frame. So, as in the previous case of Rodney King, by taking the low-res video and breaking it into frames, the analysis created a sense of change and transition that's not perceptible when you play it at normal speed. Even so, as far as I can see, his hand remains clearly in his pocket, and I cannot see the toy gun that he allegedly pointed at police. But that bend in his arm, that movement, is in the frame of the police view of history enough to give the police, who are always assumed to tell the truth, space to make a mistake. Shooting justified. A 12-year-old dies because his elbow moved. The police didn't hail him. They didn't ask him to move on. They shot him, and they got away with it. We have learned from all this that to have no racist police, as the chant in many of our streets has gone, will be to have no police at all. While reform is a tactical goal, there are all kinds of things that people are striving for, the strategy is abolition. To end white supremacy, end mass incarceration, end the police. And I will end here, but it's not over. Don't be anxious to act. Do it. Break the frame in 2016, wherever, whenever you can. Be unbounded. Shut it down. Black lives still matter. Thank you.
Okay, I didn't want to sit at the center actually, especially as I promised George Michael, and have to admit that was a profinia. Just as my role, just to announce, we open this conversation, of course, immediately, so you might already step up to enter and intervene this forum. As a role of conversationalist host here, I just want to start off the conversation. That's what you normally do, so to break some of these formalities, and also live up to the role of maybe linking this to the broader conversation of this conversation piece, and then asking you a question before we enter the common discussion. Very obvious for some of you who might have been here at another keynote was, and this is a takeaway for me, I have to say, and we should continue that, is the link between what Nicholas just showed and I.L. Weitzman's exposition of visual machines of denial and how we have to deal with that. nowadays. So that denial is already built into visual systems very actively by now. And I think we all experience that whenever we watch the news. But you can also take it to forensics. The second link is to kind of also maybe put in a gradation to the, of course, welcome oppositions that Nicholas put, just reminding ourselves for all of those who were here or who couldn't be here with the last panel of the Anxious to Act stream, there was Hiba Amin presenting her together with colleagues from the graffiti scene, from the Egypt graffiti scene, which is, of course, visual politics as well. Their successive stunt, as some would say, and success to enter the Black Lives Matter hashtag into the visual machine of Netflix and co. and the Homeland delusion that we are all subjected to. So there is, of course, a link between those different arenas of conflict and ideology. And we might discuss who we address our complaints to, whether it's ourselves we are talking to, and that's the basic frame of reference, the commons, to build the commons, or whether we have to confront this machine. So to just ask a first question, I hope at least it's very simple and legible in intent, is that what struck me, and I was not aware when we first had this conversation, is that what you talked about in the context of these new technological societies of control, audiovisual capitalism, however you want to name the beast, that something you both seem to talk about with apophenia and this kind of delusional projection is, and what you talked about, is the rearticulation, very vicious rearticulation of a very old technique of wrong vision, which is stereotyping. So it sounded a lot like all these machines you showed and these setups are very differentiated machines that re-embody stereotypes in a very material way and with very serious consequences. So I wondered whether that is a term you can think, whether this is useful from your perspectives, and it reminded me also in terms of the encounter with the policing machine with another participant we had, which is Bakma, a video collective from Turkey, taking its name exactly from what you described, Don't Look, and kind of the police performing these stereotypes and thereby, as you said, maintaining the hierarchies. So I wonder, is this something that could be inserted in either of your perspective? And then, again, please line up and let's broaden the discussion after that.
There's a lot of questions. I don't really know where to start. I mean, yes, there is not only what you call the wrong vision. I mean, first of all, I think the main thing I said, that vision has become a small part, right, of data circulation or information distribution or whatever. So in that sense, and it's really painful for me to say so as a filmmaker, right, as something that who works in image, that the role of visuality seems to be shrinking somehow. That's the first thing, right? So what do we do with that, or how is that situation going to impact on image production? And it does already, of course, you know. I mean, when you were, for example, presenting these images from the examples of cell phone evidence, right? Of course, there's already patents on how to remotely shut down the camera functions of certain cell phones in certain areas and so on. So it's not a tool that's given, it's a tool that can be withdrawn at any minute. In my experience, I have been very often faced with situation where there is, maybe let's start like that, evidence is useful sometimes, sometimes those are not useful at all, if you're the person that's under investigation. But anyhow, it can be used in a situation where there is a court, there is a law, there is a forum, there is someone to take that into account and potentially to act on it. But this is not a universal situation. I have been faced a lot of times where a situation where there is no police, there is no law, there is no court, there is no, even if there is an image, and often there is none, it doesn't matter, right? I think that, you know, the idea of evidence is still based on the impression, which still holds valid in many areas of the world, that if you present evidence, something is going to happen. But what do you do if it doesn't, right? I mean, we know that, of course, already from the Rodney King video example, how even if there is visual evidence, it is unseen, basically. No, it is denied, it is erased. On the other hand, I also want to say that I think there is, I mean, you called it wrong vision, or I called it apophenia. I think there's definitely also some merit in that, right? It's not only something that is, you know, a sort of ideological delusion, even though I agree that very often it is used as such. It is also an instrument for active misrecognition, right? Someone wants to present you with the obvious, with the thing that everyone already knows, that, you know, that is evident. And you just say, no, I'm not recognizing that. You know, I will see a face or a cloud or just nothing or whatever, but I will not see what you are telling me to see. And I think in that sense, apophenia or misrecognition can be a productive force, right? Can be a force of imagination, a generative fiction. Maybe that's my initial comments.
It's really clear that the stereotype does, in the case that I'm talking about, very much function and plays all kinds of important roles. We'll probably most remember that Darren Wilson, who was the police officer that killed Michael Brown, referred to him as a demon, and he said that he thought he looked like Hulk Hogan, who is a figure that's probably not familiar to you. He's a sort of caricature, oversized, but very white wrestler. And this actually was the only part of Darren Wilson's testimony to the grand jury that I believed, because it's just too unlikely not to be true on the one hand. And on the second hand, it's a fusion of his kind of fundamentalist Christianity worldview that there are demons and they exist and that they're real, and the kind of TV that he watches, which is wrestling. And these stereotypes literally then interpose, as it were.
I will speculate now. You know, I talked about these pattern recognition neural networks that are being trained to recognize certain patterns, right? So what do you do if your cell phone is trained to recognize demons? And whenever you want to photograph something which you think is evident, it's going to show you a demon, like these, you know, dogs that appear inside a bowl of pasta. And I think that's the interesting thing. The filtering processes are socially determined, right? They basically implement or implant these, well, call them platonic, call them racist, ideal forms or stereotypes. It's both the same in this case, and create a sort of technology that already knows the things that it's going to recognize, because otherwise it wouldn't recognize them at all.
It strikes me there are two things you can do. One is that you can do what I did with the grand jury hearing, which is to painstakingly break down the grounds on which those kinds of intervening screens are posed and show a different alternative. And that, I think, is very much what A.L. Weizmann was doing. But he and I will both agree, I think, we talked about it afterwards, that there are limits to that. There are limits to the grounds on which, and I think it comes back to the term that we keep using, the question of evidence. Evidence presupposes a court that has the right of judgment. So I think what we've seen subsequently by the dismantling of that claim, not in the police courts, but through direct actions and other modes of practice, and it comes back to a statement that Brian Holmes made at the end of the last session, which is you get a situation in a town like Chicago, which has been ruled by the police for 70 or something years, And gradually that authority is breaking down, it's changing something. I think it's a similar pattern to the one that you were describing, in the sense that people are connecting. They're seeing things that are maybe not intended, but they're seeing them. And they're making patterns. And they're forming modes of identification that are, and I agree with your other remark as well, they're not about images. I mean, I think images is a kind of pre-digital term to an extent anyway. The photographers largely think now of their material as data, and that we are in a kind of, as you eloquently put it, sea of data. How do we swim? How do we survive? What mechanisms of getting to shore can we find? One of the means has been, in the frame in which I'm working, to find each other, and to begin to finally, and this is after, in the Americas 400 years, to see each other as people, as imperfect living bodies, and allowing that other to invent us rather than being invented by us. And I think that's the challenge principally for non-black people, is to set that aside and to allow themselves to be invented by the person who is in the African diaspora. That's going to be a challenge that I agree is substantial, but I do see it happening, and I think I see that happening in the way that people have responded in Europe to the refugee situation as well, in ways we would not have predicted, perhaps.
Again, like if you want to enter and project your views into this, you are welcome. There is already one, yeah. It's two, actually.
Thank you. What you just said, Nicholas, is actually directly related to my question, which is about the deceptively simple concept of solidarity, which I've been struggling with a lot lately, and perhaps in context of this discussion, thinking about it in terms of vision or mutual recognition. I see you and you see me versus I see you and you shoot me, or I shoot you before you can see me. And I started thinking about this when I went to a Black Lives Matter protest here in Berlin at Brandenburger Tor, which was already a sort of bizarre situation of solidarity. But none of the materials preparing for the event had said anything about an alternate political message that was going to be presented at the protest, which I was surprised to find out when I got there, that it was a solidarity protest between Palestine and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I've had trouble explaining to people my problem with this, because I happen to support both of those messages quite strongly, and not only as separate entities, but I have a kind of grasp on their inextricability and the complex relationships between those two messages. But I have sort of an unease about arriving at one protest and realizing I'm at a double protest, or a larger protest, or a protest squared, or a protest that's is offering a different kind of visibility than what I had anticipated. And I've experienced this a lot. Like, you go to a music show and there's a political message you didn't anticipate. It would be a lot easier to complain if it had been like a right-wing rally I unwittingly showed up at. But I'm wondering about both of your thoughts on this idea of solidarity as mutual recognition, and how that's actually much more tricky than, it's not really a two-way thing. There are always a lot of eyes in the pasta, I guess. So.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and I would say that it appears to be simple, but if it had been simple, we would have done it a long time ago. So clearly it isn't. It's actually probably one of the hardest things to do. And the solidarity between Palestine and Ferguson in particular is historical, it's practical. It was the Palestinians seeing Ferguson people getting tear gassed and tweeting ideas to them about how you dealt with tear gas using domestic materials and how to avoid the tear gas and so on. And that led to people going back and forth, and there being a genuine sense that there was a similarity. And in the group that I've been working with, post-Occupy, called Tidal, we've been making a connection over a number of years between Palestine, Detroit, and Soweto as places that are in the edge of, or constitute metropolitan regions that are nonetheless in many ways excluded from the services and facilities that constitute those regions. So like Detroit recently, as you sure know, the city of Flint, which is just outside of Detroit, has such a poisoned water now that they're having to truck in bottled water, which makes it very similar to the situation in Palestine and to the situation in Soweto. So what I'm thinking is that we're seeing a different kind of solidarity emerge than one that was based around a particular position in relationship to a mode of production, which is where we learned this word, and how we learned to think about it, that we were all in a similar position in relation to the mode of production. Now I think we're trying to think about a similar position in relationship to globalized forms of exploitation, oppression, and so on, and finding that those are more complicated but also more resonant. So as to the organization of your particular event, I think you just have to go and become part of the organizing team and talk to them and figure out why that happened. But I think it's always, it's part of what movements do is they move. And as long as they're moving, they're alive. And if they fail to move, then they often become static. And I think that's part of what solidarity needs to be about now is how do we keep the movements that we have seen begin, or the Palestinian movement is of course long-standing and is in a dire situation at the moment, as Hito's presentation made very clear, that how do we regenerate a kind of energy where we can not just bemoan what's happening in Gaza or in the West Bank now, but think about ways in which we can implicate ourselves and implicate our, particularly, those of us that are part of the American war machine, to think about how we can disengage that machine from that situation. So these are, I agree with you totally, these are challenging and profound questions.
If I may come back to the things I said earlier about apophenia, I think really essentially solidarity has to be an act of apophenia, because it has to be an act of active misrecognition, because it has to rest on the generative fiction that even though I have nothing in common with the other person, I will act as if that were not the case. And I really think that this solidarity is based on the suspension, not the erasure, the suspension of difference in the light of a generative fiction, right?
The second over there before you come.
Hi. I'm going to try and weave a question into some of my comments and thoughts and reflections. One of the things that strikes me as a longtime consumer of American culture and Black American culture in particular is this tension you see between, on the one hand, this kind of impoverishment of Black people's agency on an everyday basis, and on the other hand, this insane popularity of different aspects of Black lives and culture in popular culture, mainstream popular culture. And I'm thinking of this especially today, and I invite you to respond because Beyonce has this new video. You've seen it, good, I'm glad you've seen it. And I was looking at it, and to me, the first thing that came to mind was this children's toy called Etch-a-Sketch. And you've got elements in that video of, like proud Southern Blackness, of, kind of queer New Orleans bounce music and dance, and everybody on my timeline really excited about this. And maybe it's another version of apophenia where you're seeing these patterns and saying like, oh, Beyonce is talking about this. And then disturbingly, there's all of this Katrina footage. Sort of, if you want to take disaster porn to another level, is it kind of okay because it's in a Beyonce video and Beyonce can do anything and it's kind of, Black power now, and it's okay because, you know what, we all have hot sauce in our bags. So I don't know, can you just kind of respond to that, maybe, that sort of tension? Because it's something that, goes around in my head a lot. So thank you.
Thanks, Maya. I just want to ask the people to maybe give a signal if you think it really adds into that same stream, because then we can collect voices and not only have this ping pong.
Are you talking about the question or?
What?
Are you
Yeah, if your question really relates to that closely, then just give me a sign. Otherwise,
I would love to respond, but I haven't seen the video. I'm sorry, but I think it's rather a comment, right? I mean, I think there is. I mean, from my point of view, certainly not having seen the video, I'll take it as a comment, really.
it's a hint.
Sorry, and I expected somebody would ask this question. And so this is a video of a song that Beyonce released yesterday. It's called Formation. It's out on her website. You can download it for free. Another title. We started getting a lot more hits on our website that was produced, title Occupy Theory, Occupy Strategy, when Jay-Z called his website title. And so this video, the number of interesting factors about it. One of the things I think is important is she's putting the image of Katrina back into a mass circulation and identifying climate change as one of the factors that play into the current crisis of Black lives. Environmental racism is, as we already mentioned in relation to Flint, I think really significant. I think the video, which concludes with a graffiti of "Stop Shooting Us," is a really powerful statement in that regard, because she's using that first person rather than saying, she might have chosen to make a more generalized statement like Black Lives Matter, but she chose to be identifying specifically with the victims of police violence. One thing that's really important to note is that she'll actually be playing soon at the halftime show of the Super Bowl, which is the kind of ultimate white macho festival where black and brown bodies are invited to beat themselves up in order to circulate commodities. Advertising for the Super Bowl costs more than any other advertising all year, still the largest television event. So Beyonce's going to do this thing in the middle of Coldplay set, and she's going to destroy them, and she's also going to therefore put into circulation something that, she's taking advantage of this window. And I think it's, for all that I'm kind of critical of the politics of representation anymore, and I don't really play the game of popular visual culture anymore, good on her, frankly. I mean, if you have that opportunity, she's taken it. It's complicated, and we could spend a long time talking about it, and maybe afterwards in the bar we can do that, but I don't want to spend all of the question period responding to something that Hito hasn't even seen.
It sounds at least like a very interesting case of clash of visualizations on many levels, so we probably all have to see it and then come back and discuss.
Hi, my name is Park. I'd just like to thank the speakers for the talk today and organizers for this great festival. I just hope this isn't too much of a tangent, but for my question, I would like to reference Hito Steyerl's essay in this year's eFlux journal on the role of museums in an age of increasing planetary conflict and inequality, where she writes, museums have less to do with the past than with the future. Conservation is less about preserving the past than it is about creating the future of public space, the future of art, and the future as such. So my question is, with the virtualization of aspects of everyday life, what are the consequences of virtual museums? Can they effectively replace the role of physical museums? Are they merely examples of institutional critique, or could they reconcile the mass destruction of museums, history, art, in areas ravaged by war and heal broken social memories?
Sounds like an interesting question at an art festival.
I can't answer this question, as you might expect, no? But I mean, it's we will have to think through that, right? Yeah.
You see, by now at the latest, you notice this is a conversation and not a Q&A, so that happens. But are there other voice questions? Because otherwise I would like to jump again to this question of like looking forward into, there is, sorry.
Oh.
Then, yes.
No, please. Okay. I don't know if it's related
It's your
directly
time.
to this part, but it's about, I find it very different, the situation in the Americas to here because of just the context. I mean, the people have been living together for many more years and more generally speak the same language. And I was wondering, how can so that the discourse of discrimination and the experience of discrimination and solidarity is very different, I think, to what we have in Europe right now. I was wondering, how can we use media and technology or any other forms, to create a more interpersonal understanding and kind of a conversation between these different groups, because I find that, it's just as simple as people may not even speak the same language and they cannot even address these issues together. Do you have any ideas on this?
Who wants to?
That's a great question, isn't it? I mean, I think that's in some ways what's at the heart of this transmediale, I guess, is to what extent do electronic and visual networks allow for that kind of conversation? And both of these talks, I think, have expressed some hesitation about that possibility. And I think we have to be aware of the limitations of the image in that sense, and that if you can't see the image, or if you can't recognize it, or if you are so bound by stereotyping. And I think we also need to be aware of the extent to which there are now, the image is also a terrain for war. It's a terrain that's used violently. We see this in France, most notably, I think, at the moment, through the sacralization of Charlie Hebdo, and this peculiar license that's given to them to vilify through images that are very intelligible, no matter what language you speak. I did note the optimism of the internet as a universal medium has been very well tempered by everybody here over the course, not just this event, but other events. That said, all that said, I think that the moment of the global social movements has offered this possibility of at least imagining ourselves to be a 99%, to be the people, as it was in Tahrir, or to be, we saw earlier on the panel preceding this, people talking about the possibility of revolution in Spain. And people think, and the speaker, I believe, is Italian, working in Spain, and she was speaking in English. And we all kind of got it. And that was very impressive on her part, much more impressive than what I'm doing here. But those possibilities do seem, there's at least a thread, right? And I think one wants to kind of cling to that thread and see where it goes, rather than say, yes, of course, we know. I mean, all the censorship, all the violence, yes, all of that. But what about that other possibility, that there are new modalities of solidarity, new possibilities? I mean, just the repeated images that we've seen on our side of people in this city greeting refugees, very remarkable, right? And transforming, frankly, the discussion about immigration on our side. And that those sorts of moments that arise, what I think is striking about them is that each individual thing, maybe it kind of peaks and it diminishes after a time, but consistently, social movements since, I would say, when the Zapatistas came out of the jungle in 1994, have been, as it were, if you want to use the nautical metaphor, the tide keeps rising on our side, and it falls, but it comes back and it's a little bit higher each time. So I mean, I don't think that's optimism. I think it is the possibility of politics.
It's a apophenia against the sea of data, maybe. But Hito,
I mean, I agree. How to use social media to make things better is maybe a too optimistic question right now. Is how to use them not to make things worse. But I totally agree, right, that people need to talk to one another over these, despite the differences in language, in context, and so on. But somehow most people, including myself, have come to intuitively assume that it will be done over the internet. Maybe we have to radically rethink that. Yeah.
I would take that as last comment for now, a question, contribution. If otherwise there's no very urgent one.
That builds on what I'm about to say, builds on what you just said. I'm curious about the relationship between the anxious to act and the anxious to secure stream of this conference. Because you said people found each other on Twitter through a hashtag, and then this hashtag translated into the offline world and traditional broadcast media. But if you find each other in such a public forum through a hashtag, that's also an unprecedented level of publicity in group formations, in associations. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the potential dangers of this very public form of association.
Sure. I mean, every time you tweet, Twitter keeps 100 pieces of metadata about what you just did. But one of the things I think I want to be cautious about is, what are they doing with all that metadata? In fact, if you ask Wall Street, not much. I mean, Twitter's being undervalued, and they're talking about it as a medium that's likely to be in retreat. I think that's partly because, frankly, Black Lives Matter and other social media groups have been able to make use of Twitter as a particularly effective messaging system. We used it in Occupy Wall Street as a sort of simultaneous messaging system when open source peer-to-peer systems couldn't keep up with the traffic of messages. Twitter did, so it was useful. Is it surprising, therefore, that it's not doing so well? Maybe not so much. I assume that there's a constant relay then between you find a moment of opportunity with a given platform, they shut that down, you move on to another platform. Whilst also, I mean, we've seen other people talking about the possibilities of creating peer-to-peer horizontal platforms. And I think the reason that Black Lives Matter works is not because of Twitter, but because after finding each other through the hashtag, that group, which actually was in existence since 2012, was set up when Trayvon Martin was killed, organized a bus ride, very 1960s style, to Ferguson. People spent a lot of time in assemblies working out, well, what is it they actually want to organize around? What are the solidarities that we see happening here? A lot of other people came to Ferguson, and there have been actions in Ferguson pretty much every day since Michael Brown was killed. So that, you know, it's absolutely not my intent for once you walking away here saying this can all be done through social media, not at all. There are certain key parts of it that you can do kind of effectively through social media, but the rest, I mean, it has to be done on the ground, face-to-face, in assembly, in discussion, in consensus, and that co-presence idea, that one can also then, in actions, use social media both to publicize, but also to message and to circulate information. That's been extremely useful to people in, you know, actual action.
Hito, do you also want to?
No, I mean, by and large, I agree. We have seen in recent years, you know, very different situations in different countries where uprisings or protest movements that were sort of catalyzed by social media have either continued or not, and sometimes they haven't, right? Because that can probably act as a catalyzer, but it cannot replace the work of organization. And I think this is very, very clearly evident if you compare different countries to one another.
Okay, I was assuming that there are some bodily energies fading, but I just see kind of a rejuvenation in the conversation. And if everyone is okay with that, I propose that we collect those statements and then make a final. Diana?
I have to say, I have a little, I hope a short comment and an observation that I find it very interesting that we've had two very, I think, very thought-provoking presentations. One dealing with political issues that resonate and actually are quite relevant here locally in Berlin, whether it's through social media or like physical proximity, and that is the conflict in Turkey and Syria. That is the refugee struggle, and that's happening around the corner from here. That happens actually in this building from time to time. And it's interesting for me that in spite of that, that the Black Lives Matter discussion, it seems more relevant for people. And I kind of wonder, like, is it just that, am I the only one here that lives in Berlin? Or am I the only one that feels like Kurdistan is quite close? That this, for me, it's interesting, because at which point does the, like, social media, how much does it matter? And how much do lives matter if it's always about something that's very far away? And that I don't think social media can cure that.
I hope, just to say something from, as I sympathize with that observation, of course, but as someone who worked with a lot of other people here, I would say parts of the answer to that question lies in the 5 years after panel and the Global Pots panel, which was engaging these questions. And we were actually pre-discussing them, and so I think it's good to insert them and in that spirit extend the conversation. But I wouldn't make a binary here. Christopher.
Yeah, I would like to thank both the speakers for this highly engaging two talks and conversation right now. And I can't refrain from just stating how important I think that it is to some of the main issues that we have discussed at Conversation Piece. And with that, make a kind of comment and question that either you can choose to answer, or you can also say if you just want to take it with you further. And that's the challenge, I think, of datafied conversations. So Hito mentioned in her lecture bringing the signal out of the noise and the different delusions attached to that. But if we go back to the original formulation of information theory, for example, from Shannon and Weaver, in the mathematical theory of information, signal and noise actually have nothing to do with the meaning of messages. That's what's clearly stated in the theory. Of course, we know it always creeps back in. But still, it seems to me that, especially we want to discuss this question of like solidarity and declaring ourselves all the 99%, this datafication of conversation creeps back in. This was part in the, and not meaning actually, and this was part of the original kind of statement of Conversation Piece, saying somehow that context replaces text. And so I'm wondering really, like, what can we do to counteract the datafication of conversation, where what is expressed on these social networks, of course, always has a use or a function somewhere else in a monetized or surveillance system. Thanks.
As it will be, in the words of Nicholas, be a hard act to fuse those two questions, I would put this another kind of turn of the screw and collect the third statement, and then you can make a creative choice about which parts you want to engage with.
Hito Steyerl was talking about the diminishing domain of the visual, and I was wondering if I can bring up sort of a counterexample of a very surprisingly instance where the visual was very influential. If it's not too banal to talk about it, is the picture of the drowning, the Syrian refugee boy that exploded in social media in September. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Professor Mirzoeff, you wrote an essay about this and about its impact. And I guess, I mean, there were a couple things, like in my Facebook feed, I had a lot of people just complaining that the picture was too raw, that they just didn't, that they felt it was like an invasion to be faced with this picture. And then I just had this very surprising, it seemed almost anachronistic how influential this picture was. It seemed to harken back to the 60s and the 70s when a photo could change your stance against the Vietnam War. That seems like today, in today's age, that there's such an inundation of images that impact is no longer there. Like, for instance, the Prime Minister of the UK, right, Cameron, he was very standoffish and aloof about the whole refugee crisis, and when he saw the picture, all of a sudden he had all this pathos and this empathy. And why was that picture that broke through, and also the problematic nature of why it broke through, then it became this focal point of all this controversy. Like, people were saying, oh, it's because the boy looks white, that's why everybody relates to it, and that's why all of a sudden everybody has all this sympathy, and that actually this sympathy is a bad sign, because it shows that only if a boy is white. And I think about Barth's, his analysis of photo. There's the punctum, and I think the sternum or whatever, but the punctum is a part of the photograph that causes cognitive dissonance or something. And there was something in that photo that made people not just look away or not be desensitized. And I'm curious, since we have two masters of analysis of visual culture, what your take on that was.
So the last word doesn't belong to the masters, but the last word of this conversational stage turn now belongs to the two of you, and you can choose.
Well, I chose, I never saw that picture, actually, and it was a very conscious choice. But I think that I agree, it made a huge ripple, if you like, in the sea of data, but this is probably a prime example of how visual evidence acts in a field where there is no court and no one to take it to, and basically no framework. Then it causes some kind of, ripple of indignation, which is short-lived and actually doesn't change a lot, because you know that every day more children drown in the same way, and there is no images. I'm actually, I don't mind, but the information is there, everyone knows about it, and basically not a lot has changed.
Nicholas?
So let me just say in starting that I would take the point that was raised over there a moment ago about not speaking, as the discussion not having been as centered on the question of refugees and the Syrian crisis and so on. And it seems, my feeling is if we had longer, and if we were not speaking in this incredibly formal way, that it would turn that way, and it seems that it is turning that way. And just for myself, I didn't feel that it was kind of appropriate to come from New York to here and tell you about the situation on your own doorstep. I was hoping we could do that sort of more by implication than by analogy. The Alan Kurdi image, I mean, it is indeed a striking image, and I don't want to repeat the essay that I've already published on it, which you referred to, which is online, and people can Google it and take a look at that if they're interested. But I think we want to sort of pause again and realize that that image had its effect in terms of it was measured by things like the number of times that people on Twitter started referring to refugee rather than migrant. There's a very clear spike in that term, but then it fell off. And Cameron did indeed stop being quite so ugly about refugees for a while. And then last week he started referring to them again, as I quote, a bunch of migrants. So it is, as it were, a temporary effect. And just as it was, I think, in the 60s. And I think we have to be careful of the mythology of the 1960s photographs. I mean, if you talk to people who were around at that time and remember, like, the gap between the iconic photographs of the Vietnam War and the end of the war is actually quite long. And most of the people that died on both sides, principally, of course, Vietnamese, died subsequent to the most famous iconic Vietnam photographs that we can all summon into our minds right now. And it's only now that we're starting to see the circulation of photographs taken by the Vietnamese. There's a very interesting set of photographs online at the moment right now that people might have seen. And I think we're going to need to sort of start to put those into dialogue with the photographs that we know and try and measure what effect are we really seeing in that 60s moment. And we'll have the same cause, I think, to think about how we can keep both the image and the politics and the presence of the refugee and the undocumented and the migrant and all those targeted by the police in the forefront of our minds as we go forward.
May I add something? Because I think it's one of the rare instances where I really have an answer to a question, right? It almost never happens, but I think in this case I really have a suggestion, right? Because I feel this extreme resistance and even, I wanting to look at that picture and much even less to discuss it, because there is such a simple way to go, right? The way is just to rebuild Kobani for that instance, or all the other places in Syria where people are fleeing from. It's really simple. We don't have to talk about the picture. Rebuild Kobani, rebuild Shengal. People are already doing it. And then there is no worry. We don't have even to worry about that picture. It's about people being able to stay there and live there.
I think this is a perfect way to switch modes and enter the interpersonal exchange that has been mentioned before, as most political issues can't be resolved on any stage, and as Nicholas also said, anxious to act is nice, and I think it's a precondition for some getting into the act, but the acting is the important thing. So now the acting can move over to wherever you decide the important spotlight should be. I'm very definite and hopeful that some of the conversations that started here and that started in this series of conversations, because this is not an isolated one, that they will continue between Spain, Turkey, Bahrain, Egypt, whatever country, city, or region of the world was present here. And anyone is, of course, now free to share and offer their ways to get into action or to recreate, to be able to act maybe tomorrow. So I thank everyone for putting up the energy, especially people who traveled a lot. I think we have to be thankful for this act of solidarity in communication and this stretch. I thank the audience for, I think, a really multifaceted discussion and a differentiated one. We were kind of thinking about whenever you try to get to acts and activism and political statements, it's easy to fall in the trap of binaries and two color systems or these kinds of false alternatives. I think we circumvented that in a good way, and I'm very grateful for this start of a conversation, and I hope it continues. So thank you.